Hello everyone, this is NEWMEDIA, your instructor for this Writing for New Media online course. Right now we're on the second module and we're going to discuss about media theories. Why are we going to discuss this? Because we want you to understand that producing media content is more than just being able to create stunning media web content, multimedia graphics, videos, etc. What we want you to understand as well by the end of this course is what kind of impact will your content have. And if you understand what kind of impact you have, you will be more considerate, or you will be more cautious when it comes to deciding what type of content you are going to produce. So that's basically what we're going to do with this media theories discussion. Now, when we say theory, of course, we know that it's basically a set of concepts or ideas that try to explain certain phenomenon. Now, theories are just theories because they're not proven facts, but they're just since they are based on scientific method, then there's a sort of accuracy when it comes to the explanations they tend to give when it comes to certain media phenomenon. Now let's take a look at some of these media theories. Now there are a lot of them, but maybe we'll just take a look at some. So media theories are under the branch of theories called communication theories. Since World War II, these theories were made under the field of communication studies. Now, most of the studies are based on the impact of communication and media on human society. So that's basically what we're trying to look at with these media theories. Now, the first theory I want you to understand is called the spiral of silence theory. The one who proposed this was Elizabeth Newman in 1974. She said here that the theory refers to the tendency of people to remain silent and hold their views that are contrary to the majority view on a subject. One example for that, for instance, is let's look at what the situation we have right now. We're under an enhanced community quarantine. So there may be some set of people who are in favor of extending the quarantine up until maybe June or August, but there are also some who are against. So just for an example, let's say maybe 90% of the public are in favor of extending, let's say. So that 10% of those people who are against extending the quarantine are the minority viewpoint. Now, under the spiral of silence theory, since those who are against the extension of quarantine are the minority viewpoint, what will happen is that they will remain silent about their views and they will not share it with people because it's just the minority view. They have a sort of fear of isolation because of that. Now, for this theory to be plausible, it relies on the idea that everyone has the intuitive way of knowing what the prevailing or consensus opinion happens to be. So, a spiral is created and reinforced when someone from the majority speaks out. Hence, the minority begins to distance themselves, and therefore the fear begins to mount. So, let's look at the model that tries to explain this theory. So you see that spiral is there in the model. Up on the topmost is the prevailing public opinion, or the majority view. So if you're on the prevailing public opinion, that means you are more willing to speak out because everyone around you agrees with you. But what if you have a viewpoint that doesn't agree with everyone else's? So you have that minority viewpoint. So as less and less people have the minority viewpoint, then that spiral of silence slowly goes up until that bottom part, where the effect is there, the fear of isolation. Um, so basically, again, it says that the people holding views contrary to those dominant in the media, looking at the media perspective, they are moved to keep those views to themselves for fear of rejection. So if we apply this spiral of silence theory in media, if the content in media, for example, is mostly gearing towards extending the quarantine, then if you're a person who is against extending the quarantine, you will have you will undergo that spiral of silence because you have a fear that since most of the media content and most of the public are pro extending the quarantine, then you'll be afraid to speak out. So that's basically the spiral of silence theory. Now, there are two reasons why this happens according to the theory. First is, again, what I said earlier, the fear of isolation. That's when the group or the public realizes that the individual has a different opinion, or what you call divergent opinion from the status quo. Another explanation is fear of reprisal, or what you call a more extreme isolation, in the sense that voicing your opinion, that minority opinion, might lead to a negative consequence beyond that of just an isolation. So if in the first reason there's just an isolation, in the second reason there could be a more negative impact, like what? Your status in society will be affected, you will lose your job, even your relationship could suffer, relationship with friends, family, loved ones, etc. So those are two reasons that the theory tries to list down when it comes to explaining why the spiral of silence happens. So okay, so that's clear. We're clear on that first theory. Now let's take a look at the second theory. This one is called agenda setting theory. So the agenda setting theory was proposed in 1968 by Max Combe and Donald Shaw. It says here that the mass media have the ability to transfer the salience of issues on their news agenda to the public agenda. So basically, it says here that the media has the power to set the agenda. So kung ano yung ilabas ng media, ng news, that is the talk of the town, basically. So this theory states that the media has the ability to tell the audience what should be the issues that are important and what should be the issues that they should think about. So basically, you set the agenda as a media content. Now viewers basically just accept and adopt the information in their own lives according to this theory. So it's because of also this theory that the concept of popular culture was created. So the point of this theory is that that's how powerful media is. Just by choosing a certain information as the content to produce, or as the lead story in your content, you're basically telling people that this is the most important issue that they need to discuss. So one example of this possible impact of this kind of theory is, for instance, let's say what happened to if there's a certain scandal that happened, let's say ano bang recent scandal, maybe about, if you remember a few years ago, the scandal of Chris Aquino, her sex scandal with, let's say, Joey Marquez, etc., where she acquired this sort of STD. And another recent was yung the squabble between the Barreto sisters. It became part of the national conversation just because the media decided to put it in the news cycle as part of the content of their newscasts. So it became talk of the town. So that's how powerful media is. Just by choosing certain stories to be part of the stories that need to be told on media, you set the agenda already. So that's how powerful they are. Now let's look at the model. So here you see that there's a certain reality. So that reality is Aside from that, there's also a media reality. Basically, the media reality is the agenda that the media sets. And there's also a public perception of reality. So, because the news journalists tend to choose what is the agenda, then because the public view chooses content from the media, they have a certain perception of reality because of that kind of agenda that the media set. So that's how this model tries to explain this theory. So basically, this theory refers to the power of media because of repeated news coverage. It tends to raise the importance of a certain issue in the public's mind. Like for instance, in today's time, we see that most newscasts are all about COVID-19, which means that they're trying to set the agenda that this is the most important issue. And if most likely you will agree, because it's affecting all of us right now, because we're having this online class and not everyone is allowed to go out, all work is stopped, etc. So maybe in that sense, the agenda setting theory, the agenda setting power of media is correct. But you can also use this theory to criticize media if, let's say, for example, COVID-19 is the most important issue, but what if they chose another scandal as the top story of the day? Then you can question the media there, that why are you doing that story if that's not the important issue of the day? So yeah, okay. Now I guess that's clear again to you. Now let's go to the next theory. This is called cultivation theory or cultivation effect theory. So this theory suggests that television is responsible for shaping, or based on the title of the theory, cultivating the viewers' thoughts of social reality. So basically, mass media cultivates attitudes and values which are already present in culture. Because if you remember our definition of media in the earlier module, one of its functions is really to reflect what culture is in society. Now, the media takes attitudes which are already present and then represents them in a different form for the viewers. Now, often, the audience is unaware that they are just absorbing constructed attitudes, not the exact attitudes, but basically how the media just perceives these attitudes. So let's look at the model. So you see there's TV viewing in the case of the television media platform. Then there's the power of the capacity of focusing strategies, attention involvement. There's the learning aspect to it. And then you also have the incidental information. And then after that, you have skills, inference skills, social structures, and other experiences. And combine that with TV viewing, your perception of social reality is then affected. So basically, again, in summary, this theory says that television, for instance, cultivates or creates a view of the world that becomes the reality, even though sometimes it could be possibly inaccurate. So, but even if it's inaccurate, the people tend to believe it, that it's the reality. And that's the worldview. And so, the effect of that is people will base their opinions of the world or their judgments of the world because of that kind of attitude. So that's the danger and probably also the strength, or probably other the opportunities of the power of media. So again, if you look at another example, the mean world syndrome. If you see the drawing there below, it says here that there's the mother. I think it's the mother. She's saying that if you keep watching that violence in your head is going to explode, splattering your mushy brains all over my nice clean carpet, and then you see there the child saying cool. So why do you think that is the kind of opinion the child has? Uh, because of the mean world syndrome, in the sense that most of the media content are all about violence. it, the child becomes desensitized to it, in the sense that he or she thinks that it's just the normal thing that happens. So basically, uh, again, the theory says that the longer a person watches television, the more they are susceptible to media messages and beliefs that these messages are indeed real. So, even though most of the media content are not the exact reality, because you keep on watching it, you tend to believe that it's what the reality is right now. So if most of media content are all about violence, then you'll think that it's normal, and then you'll have that kind of perception. So that's the mean world syndrome example. So that's also another criticism of media. Why do you keep talking about violence, etc., bad stuff, bad news? Why don't you report good news, etc.? um well, if someone from me in the media will try to defend ourselves, I'll, if I may try, I would probably tell you that that's because we are in the mainstream media, we are in the commercial media, we don't work for the government media. That is the role of the government media, to report what is the achievements, accomplishments of government. Our role is to point out what needs to be done, because if we're reporting all the good news and then all these bad news are neglected, then these bad news will not be solved. Uh, the reason why they're being reported is because we want government, we want people to know that this is happening, and for them to take action. So I'm not trying to really defend, but I'm just trying to explain why it's the situation. But it's also your responsibility as the public to not just consume content from a single media source, but also take a look at the other sources as well, so that you don't just have one kind of content that you consume. So it's part of media literacy, media responsibility as a viewer. So that's it. Anyway, now let's go to the next theory. This is called the uses and gratification theory in 1970. Now, this theory is concerned with how people use media for gratification of their needs. Now, if you look at the first three theories that we've discussed, it's all about the power of media over the public. Now, this theory now takes a look at the power of the public over the media. It says that you as an audience have the power to choose what kind of content you want to see and use for your own gratification. So the fact that you as people can choose what you want to see and read, and that there are many other media outlets that are in existence that are competing against each other for your attention, then that means that they are not as powerful as you might think, to have that kind of influence over the public, because the public also has the choice. If you look at the model, the usage or the behavior of the viewers is affected by the choices that they need, what their purposes are. So these are information seeking, uses for interpersonal, entertainment, pastime, convenience. So these are just some examples of why they tend to use they consume certain content of media. So under this theory, again, the uses and gratification theory, media then has limited effects on the audience, because in reality, based on this theory, the audience is actually in control of media. in terms of selection and processing of the information from these media. So you see the different perspectives that these theories are having. So that's why these are just theories and not established facts, because not not all situations these theories will apply. There will only be certain instances where these theories will likely be able to explain these phenomena. Okay, so let's go to the next one. This is called play theory. So this theory is emphasized on how we use media for our satisfaction, and also how media brings changes in our lives according to its contents. So it's similar again to the cultivation effect, in the sense that the point is that media is primarily for unimportant personal use. So if in uses and gratification theory, there's the possibility of an audience using the media for information, this play theory poses that it's really just for unimportant use, unimportant needs or wants of a person. So what are examples of that? You just watch teleseries, or you just watch anime, or you just watch cartoons, or you just watch the news because you want to laugh at Mike Enriquez coughing, or you want to see the mistakes of the anchors, probably those stuff. So that's an example of the play theory phenomenon. Okay, now let's go to another theory. This is called the media system dependency theory. So it says here that the more dependent a person is on having his or her needs gratified by the use of media, the more important will be the role media plays in that person's life. And therefore, the more influence the media will have on that person. So imagine how many hours a day do you consume media? Let's say social media, for instance, in your age as Gen Z or millennials. Imagine the more hours you spend consuming social media, then it will have so much influence on you. The beliefs you will hold, the ideas you will share to your friends, all of those stuff come from the information you got from social media, because spent most of the time there. You don't read newspapers, which is more informative. You don't read books. That's why your opinions will probably be, for example, shallow, because you only consume TikTok, or you only consume Instagram, diba? So that's one impact of media on a person, based on the explanation of this media system dependency theory. That's how dangerous it could be if one is so much dependent on a certain media. Okay, now let's look at another theory. This is called media hegemony. So when you say hegemony, what do you mean, diba? It's basically the domination over something. So it says here that it suggests that the ideas of the ruling class in society become the ruling ideas throughout society. So the mass media are seen as controlled by the dominant class in society, and therefore they are aiding in exerting the control of that class over the rest of society. So, diba? So basically, if you remember the etymology or the origins of the term hegemony, it's basically from the Middle Ages, where the ruling class, those who the landlords, diba? The aristocrats, the monarchs, since they own most of the media, for example, in this theory. Therefore, they control what the views, the dominant opinion will be in society, because it poses the idea that that's how powerful media is. So imagine if most of the media are owned by rich people, then they don't have a grasp, really, of what the situation is on the grassroots. For example, the poor, the needy, the marginalized, the minorities. So because they are the ruling class, they own the media. The danger is that most of the content will be what? Uh, what do you call it? Mostly Borghese. um, it won't be as understanding of the situation of the poor, of the needy, etc. So that's a criticism based on this theory. Although, of course, if you look at the situation now, that's not really the case, because um, most media outlets also try to report the situation from the grassroots, from the people who are in need, etc. So probably this theory can explain a little aspect of what is happening in the media industry. Now let's take a look at another theory. This is called the third person effect hypothesis. So it says that certain messages have little effects on people like you and me, but the ordinary reader is likely to be influenced by quite a lot. So if you look at it, there's the first person, which is the media. You are the second person, who is somewhat media literate. And then there's the third person, who is not media literate. So that third person, because he doesn't know how to consume media properly, then he will tend to have the most media effect upon him or her. So he will have the most tendency of believing something that comes from media, even if it's not true. So that's the danger of it as well. So another point here is that people tend to perceive that mass media messages have a greater effect on others than on themselves, based on personal biases. So that's the third person effect hypothesis. The next one is called catharsis hypothesis. It's similar to the mean world syndrome we mentioned earlier. It says here that consuming media violence causes a reduction of aggressive drive through a vicarious expression of aggression. So if in the mean world syndrome, it explains that you become desensitized to violence, this one, in the catharsis hypothesis, the opposite is happening. You become more violent as a person. You become more aggressive because you tend to consume a lot of violence from media. So if you tend to watch wrestling videos or WWE, tend to watch mostly action films or gory horror films, then if those are the realm of media content that you only consume, nothing else at all, then there could be a possibility, according to this hypothesis, that you will be aggressive. I'm not sure if that's true to some of you, but say, you can tell me in the feedback under this video or in the Google Classroom if you are one of them. But yeah, this is the theory based on catharsis hypothesis. Now let's go to the social learning theory. Now this one, it says that behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning. So people tend to mimic what they watch in television or let's say other media, and then it influences how they act and what roles they play. So it's like if you remember the Bantay Bata advertisement, that says uh, ang mali nagiging tama sa mata ng bata kapag ginagawa ng matanda. So, for example, the matanda is the media. If the bata tends to see violence from the matanda repeatedly, then the child will think that it's the right thing or it's not wrong. So that's another example. Another explanation here is that it acknowledges that human beings are capable of cognition, in other words, thinking, and that they can benefit from observation and experience. It recognizes that much human learnings take place through watching other people model various behaviors. So I have here a link. You can watch this in another time. It tries to explain also this theory. Now, I hope it's clear already to you. Now let's go to another theory. This one is called media imperialism. Para dun sa mga tibak dyan. Ibagsak, imperialismo. Now this theory says that the one-way, non-reciprocal flow of information and cultural influence in the international media environment, which embodies cultural domination of the third world by the West. So it's a little too theoretical, but I'll try to explain it to you in a more layman's terms. So when you say when you try to look at the situation we have right now, we are living in a third world country, and then you have the first world countries, which are the US, what else? The UK, Russia. So all those countries before the Cold War. So the concepts of first world, second world, third world were developed during that time. Kasi, diba? Now, if you look at the media environment, the media situation in the international scale, what are the international news channels or international media that are available today? You have CNN, BBC, Reuters, Agence France Presse. So those are the international media that we have today. And these are what? These are owned by first world countries. These are owned by the US, the UK, etc. So what happens, according to the media imperialism theory, is that most of the information and the cultural values that is being presented to the world are from the perspective of these first world countries. Is that dangerous? It could be, because the international media doesn't have any voice for the third world countries. Or for example, in a geographical scale, Asia, there's no Asian international channel that can rival CNN or BBC in terms of reach, international reach. The closest one would probably be Al Jazeera from Qatar, or Channel News Asia from Singapore. So at least these news channels are able to provide a different perspective of the world. Because if most of the media will be controlled by just the first world countries or the West, for instance, then what happens is all the cultural values that we hold dear, let's say the love for capitalism, or the love for US brands, UK brands, etc., Western brands, will be passed on to countries like us. And that's probably the danger that the media imperialism theory tells us, that because all these media, international media, are showcasing these Western concepts, Western brands, that's the reason why people here in the Philippines don't patronize local products. They are more inclined to buy international products or branded products for that sense, in that sense, right? So I guess that explains to you what this theory tries to say. Now, the last theory I want you to understand is called technological determinism. So it tries to explain that the most important effect of communication media is that they affect our habits and perception and thinking because of the technology, because of these media. So, for example, what is the dominant media? What is the dominant media that you use? It explains what kind of habits, what kind of thinking you have. So if you look at a certain person who tends to consume a media technology called newspaper versus another person who consumes a media technology that is able to use social media, then it will probably give you an idea that these two people will have different perceptions of life, of the world, because they have different technologies that they use to consume media. So that's basically the point of the technological determinism. Technology, in this sense, media, determines what kind of perception you have, or even the habits. If there's social media, you can use it anytime you want. There will be people who are so addicted that they don't sleep anymore. So it has an effect on their habits in terms of sleeping habits. Whereas newspapers are just released in the morning, for instance, then that person will not be as sleep deprived as the person who tends to consume social media. So again, those are just some of the theories I want you to understand at the moment. There are so many others. You can try to read up on them if you want, and I doubt you will try to, because these are already so much. But I hope I gave you already an idea the kind of impact media has on people, and I hope by understanding that you will be more considerate. You will think twice before you choose to write something, because sometimes people are, or they just want to do content. They just want to satisfy their own needs, or they just want to make people happy, but they're not thinking about the consequences. They're not thinking about the impact of their actions, the kind of values that they may be able to influence people on having. So I hope by understanding that these theories that I explained to you earlier, you will take another step back before you try to produce certain content. Alright, so that's all that we have for this module. Let me know in the comments of the Google Classroom what you think of this class, if there are any concerns you have, and if you have other suggestions you want to be considered to make our online learning more efficient and more conducive for you guys, let me know. So take care.